what authors, in my humble opinion, need to do is write what you want to write. And then once you've done that, then you need to look at it with the help of an editor or a freelance editor or your agent, if you get one or whatever. And then you put that kind of final polish to something.
First of all, Peter, nice to meet you.
You too, Jonathan. Really, thank you for having me.
Thank you. You work with FinePrint Literary, yeah?
Yes, FinePrint Literary Management. It's a New York-based agency that was created in 2007 when I merged my beginning agency, the Peter Rubie agency, with the imprint agency, which at the time was run by a close friend of mine who was also an agent.
Oh, awesome. Do you actually own it, or is it
yes,
kind of a partnership?
We are what you would call a boutique agency. We're a small agency.
Okay.
Actually, we're not.
Okay.
We're not as small as we used to be.
Right.
We've had kind of ups and downs. I was an editor before I became an agent.
Okay.
At Walker and Company.
What made you want to be an agent versus staying an editor?
Actually, it's an interesting question. The short version of that story is that I came to work. I was an editor for about 6 years at a company called Walker and Company, which is different to the one in England, which is a children's. So this was Sam Walker, who was the head of that particular company, is the Walker part of George Walker Bush.
Okay.
He's part of that family, and so he was connected in strange ways to the Yale Skull and Crossbones Club and all the rest of it. Because whenever I told people I worked at Walker and Company, they would turn around to me and say, "Oh, CIA front," and I would say, "Don't be ridiculous." But then I found out by weird chance that the CIA during the 1960s had actually been funding the Socialist Workers newspaper,
Okay.
which was the communist newspaper, American communist newspaper, just to make sure that it was around so they could point to it and show how much of a danger it was. which is like, you gotta love the thinking there.
Wow.
And then I found out that Sam had actually been one of the guys that founded Radio Free Europe.
Okay.
So it wasn't so far away, but it didn't really impact anything I did. You know, I mean,
right.
You know, if I wanted to do something, I would go into Sam and I would say, I want to buy this because, you know, this guy's brilliant and he's fabulous.
Right.
You know, there was a very famous editor, and people have written biographies about him. And I would go in and say, this author is this guy's grandson. We got to do it, you know. And Sam would say, and I'd say, but it's like, and he really forced me to think about the publishing industry for what it really is, which is that it is an industry that the simplest way to describe it is to say that it has a kind of a dual personality. As far as publishers are concerned, this is an industry that is interested only in how many copies of the book can we sell.
I'm so glad you said that. I'm so glad you said that.
Every industry has that approach.
Right.
The editors within that company are the ones who would then try and, as much as they could, maintain the quality and the standards. But, you know, I've had rejections in the past, and not so much in the past, where editors have turned around to me and said, I love this book, but I could not convince my team that we should do it, which is perhaps the most frustrating rejection of a book I have ever received. And I'm not alone in that. Most agents have probably had something very similar to that.
Okay, so for the writers who don't know what you're talking about here, you're saying you accepted a client.
Yes.
You liked their book. You turned it over to an editing team, and they said
no. I didn't turn it. All right. So let me jump back a bit. It's interesting we've got into this from this direction.
Right.
But as it happens, the way the editorial process would work, I represent agents, writers. I'm sorry.
Right.
Some of my writers are agents,
Right.
or
Right.
editors, but that's not what I was trying to imply. So what I'm doing is another word for an agent, the one that we tend to like, but it's a bit kind of mothballed now, is authors' representatives.
Okay.
It's kind of implied,
Yeah.
One of the things I think a good agent should have is a sense of righteous indignation on behalf of their clients.
Right.
It helps them, you can't treat my
Right.
author like that. And you were asking me how, the short version is I left editing because Sam, my boss, drowned, which was, it was an interesting story, which I won't go into. But basically, he was in a canoe and he had a diabetic attack, and it seemed to do for him.
Sorry to hear that.
Yeah, well, it was a long time ago. And then they fired half the company because they weren't sure what to do, which is not uncommon. I mean, this is about 1989, 1990, something around there. And because I'm also a published writer, so my agent, who's a close friend of mine, said, I'm pregnant and I'm looking for a partner. Do you want to be an agent? To which I said, Patooey, they sell stuff. I am.
Right.
And she said, but every argument you've been telling me about has been, you can't do this to an author. And I thought, well, yeah, that's right. I have sort of stuck up for my authors as their editor. And so she said, well, that's agenting. I'm sort of shortening the conversation somewhat.
Sure. Yeah.
So I kind of, in the same way that when I got into publishing, because I wanted to figure out how I could best get into the industry from the perspective of a writer, which is really how I've always approached the industry. I was a journalist before I was here. I worked for BBC Radio for a while. I had a kind of a checkered background.
Okay.
I became an agent because I thought, I can represent authors that I want to, and so that's how I got into agenting. But going back now circularly to the other part of your question, which is how does the system work?
Right.
Basically, what happens is an editor can say no easily. And in New York, as opposed to LA, people say no a lot more than in LA, where they have various versions of yes.
For sure, yeah.
Which you have to figure out.
Right.
Let's do lunch. That's a no.
Right.
Usually it's a no. But anyway, so the moment an editor wants to say yes to something, he then has to convince in an editorial meeting others in the company, the marketing, sales and marketing, publicity, that there's something here that, we can make money from this book. This author will go and do that.
Is this at the publishing?
This is at the publisher's end. So every publishing house, pretty much. I mean, with the smaller ones, it gets a bit more, often there's only like one or two people.
Right.
But the editor is just one cog in a system that has to work fully. An editor can't take something on if sales and marketing and publicity don't think they can do anything with it. And it wouldn't be much use even if they could.
And I'm sorry, I just want to clarify because we have new writers who don't know.
I understand.
You're talking about the acquisitions editor.
I'm talking about the acquisitions editor. That's exactly right. What I'm now trying to describe is what happens on the publishing side of relationship that I have.
Okay, perfect.
So, and then I'll sort of backtrack a bit and talk about me in a second. But from the publisher's perspective, they are looking for a book that will make them money. And the editor is looking to fall in love with a book that she can convince her colleagues is just really, you can't not publish this.
Right.
Fits all the criteria that we're looking for in a book or in an author. And so that means that you have to kind of balance things out.
Okay.
And what that means for an author, and again, I'll get go back to this in a second, but what that means for an author is that what authors, in my humble opinion, need to do is write what you want to write.
Mm-hmm.
And then once you've done that, then you need to look at it with the help of an editor or your freelance editor or your agent, if you get one or whatever. And then you put that kind of final polish to something so that I know what editors are likely to look for.
Right.
I'm not, agents don't so much sell stuff. I know everybody, we use that term a lot, but actually what we're doing is we're licensing it anyway. So you'll get the book back eventually under whatever circumstances the book goes out of print. What I'm doing is I'm trying to match make. So I am looking for editors who I know who will, fall in love with the material the way I've fallen in love with it, which is why I've taken it on.
Right.
In order that, my passion will connect with their passion, which will clearly connect with the passion for the author brought to the book in the first place.
Right.
And so that's kind of the chain that goes on.
So you take, just so that I can understand.
Yeah.
And a writer queries you, and let's just say you love it. You love it. You take it on. You then search out publishers who are looking for this type of story.
Yeah, I mean, in a really shortened version, that's true. I mean, the one step in there that agents are so idiosyncratic in terms of how we approach something. You don't have to, there's no test for being an agent. You can just hang a shingle up and say, hey, I'm an agent. Of course,
wow.
Then, yeah, but I mean, anybody could do things like that, but the problem is, do you know there's a skill to the job? You got to know what you're doing, and then you got to know who you're going to send it to. You just can't blindly, you don't want to be selling, a thriller about a suicidal, psychopathic nun, to a romance editor.
Right, exactly. It's got to fit. It's got to be a good fit.
It has to, yeah. So you're looking for, an editor, and having been in the business for a few years, and it takes probably 3 to 5 years, maybe a little longer now, because the business has contracted a bit.
For sure. I do want to talk to you about that too. I have a couple of questions
I'm happy
on
to talk about that. But as I said, all of these things are all linked in, so it's like we're pulling it apart in order to give an answer to what seems to be a simple question.
Right. Yeah.
Which is not as simple as it first appears to be. But it's all down to the fact that what I will do when I get something, I'll talk to the author about it, and I will say, look, I think this book is about this, and this is how I see it. And most of the time, 8 times out of 10, the author will say, oh my God, you're brilliant. I love it. To which I go, no. But secretly you think, yes.
Right.
Then you turn around and you say, okay, well, look, if we're on the same page, and I used to edit as an editor, it was the same thing. Before I acquired a book as an editor, I would always ask the agent if I could talk to the author. We would have a conversation. And
I didn't know that.
Well, not everybody does it. I mean, that's just how I used to work as an editor.
I got you.
I was the kind of editor that I was looking for as a writer, in the same way that I'm the kind of agent that I'm looking for, although I have an agent, but that's, what I would be looking for in an agent.
Sure.
So I've always approached this, publishing very much with the sensibility of a writer.
Okay.
With the one proviso that it doesn't matter how, I've been in the publishing for nearly 40 years, which is, as I say that, really frightening. I mean, I haven't been married that long, it's like, and
it's the first wife.
Commitment to my wife than there is to the industry, though I have the commitment to the industry. But sorry, I lost my train of thought.
No problem.
What were we talking about? Remind me a second.
We were talking about the process in which when the writer takes it on, or writer queries an agent,
Right. No, so yes,
getting
right,
it to the editor.
Sorry, as a staunch Democrat, I apologize for my Biden moment.
No problem.
God bless him.
Uh,
Then we can still sort of function afterwards, so it's all right.
right.
So what I will do is I will then go in and I will talk to the author about, well, have you thought about doing it this way or doing it that way? And I am now trying to put the final polish on. I am in some ways, and I always hate to use sports metaphors because I really don't know one end of a ball from the other, but the truth is that what I'm doing is putting the polish on. If you were going to sell your car, and it's a wonderful car, but it's old, you'd be much better advised to at least wax and polish it before you sell it.
Right. Make it presentable.
And make sure that it kind of, exactly.
Right.
And so to a degree, I am a coach. I am, the guy that says you need to clean your house before you sell it, that kind of thing. And so, that's what we're doing, but you can't make an author do that. The author, the secret of editing, and there's a whole other thing we can get into, but essentially the secret of editing is that it's not about what I like as an editor. It's not about, oh, you've got a cat. Well, I'm really a dog person. Can't we make it a dog?
Right.
We're not doing that. What an editor is doing is, okay, it's a cat. Does the cat have a function?
Right.
Why is the cat there?
Right.
And so you're asking people, to think about what they've done in terms of, does it make it read smoother? Does it make it read better? Is there more emotional impact in there?
Right.
So,
where's the message?
Very often, well, not even the message, but books are about things.
Right.
So where you mean message, it's really what's the theme,
right.
The book about whatever,
Yes.
It's a thriller set in 1912 in New York with a female police officer, but it's in some ways about the first wave of feminism.
Right.
That kind
exactly.
of stuff. That's going to be there, but it's not the theme particularly.
Okay.
The book is about how the cop catches the villain,
Right. Yeah.
And so, but you're looking for those kinds of things as an editor. It's and very often what you're doing is you are articulating for an author something that they already know. They might not have been able to articulate it themselves,
right,
until somebody said, well, it's really about this, in my opinion.
Right.
And then you go, oh yes. And then that helps you get that book straight. And then that's the book that I will then start to submit to a variety of editors who I think will like this kind of book.
So even after you take a writer on, it still might be some time before it's ready to go to the acquisitions editors.
Yeah, oh yeah. In my case, very commonly so. I mean, in the decades that I've been an agent, I can think of a handful of books, literally 5 or 6, that arrived on my doorstep ready to go. The author thought they were ready to go.
Right.
I had another opinion, and I have a couple of projects now that I'm going out with where, this one is, I had an author, for example, well, I won't go into too many details, but he's a white guy who grew up in the Arkansas Delta.
Okay.
And he's a published poet, and he's been a major civil rights supporter since the 1960s. I mean, when he found out that Martin Luther King was shot, he left New York, where he was having just graduated from university, and returned to Arkansas to teach in English in black schools.
Oh, wow.
That was his response to what happened. So, I mean, he's had decades of this. And his story, which was published originally we're now working on his second book. His first story was called Damaged Heritage. And it involves the fact that he was quite a religious man, and one of his friends in the church was a black woman. And he was asked by the Episcopalian Church to write an apology for slavery.
Okay.
for the, on behalf of the Episcopalian Church. And in his research, he came across an article by I.W. Wells, which talked about a massacre of black sharecroppers in 1919 in a town called Elaine in the Arkansas Delta.
Okay.
And he had grown up just around the corner from that, and he'd never heard anything about this. He'd never heard anything. His friends had never heard anything about this. It wasn't so much a secret as it was just not talked about.
Right.
And then he discovered, I mean, a couple of hundred people died in this thing. I mean, this was not small, and this predated what happened in Tulsa.
Right.
And it was essentially sharecroppers were asking for more money.
Okay.
You know, for the job that they were doing, cotton pickers, that kind of stuff. Because they'd just come home from World War I, and they were like, "Hey, you know, what the hell?"
Right.
And you know, the white forces kind of said, "This isn't going to happen." And the result of that ended up going to the guy called Scipio Jones, who was a very famous lawyer, ended up taking the case of the families to the Supreme Court.
Right.
But in the middle of all this, he discovered that his grandfather, who had helped raise him when he was a child, had been a member of one of the mobs that had taken place in this, which was horrified. I mean, it's sort of like discovering that, you know, the grandfather that you love that used to hang out was actually a member of the Nazi party.
Right.
Know, that kind of shock.
Oh, man.
And not only that, but Sheila, his friend, had a granduncle, which is the brother of her grandfather, who was, injured and hurt as a result of this experience. And so,
oh, wow,
you would think that two people, just basically a generation apart from that, would have kind of said, you know what, let's just like take a break here.
Right.
But in fact, what they did, and one of the things that I mentioned to him at the very beginning when we started to work together, when we talk about the polishing and the coaching and all that, was I said, you can't just tell this story. There has to be a focus to it. And it seems to me that this is a story about racial reconciliation and how two people went out of their way to find common ground and move forward to the point where in Elaine, in Arkansas now, there is a memorial to the hundreds that died as the result of the work that, my client and his friend put in over several years to get this done.
That is amazing.
And he got an immense amount of support and encouragement from Black church members, Black intellectuals. I mean, he's really
the power of words right there. Just what the impact can be.
Right. And so the sequel, which he's working on now with me, is about what they did. This reconciliation. And there's a wonderful quote, and I don't have it to hand, and I can't remember who it's by, so please forgive me. But it was in the 1960s, there was a Black intellectual. I could look all this up for you while we're talking, but I'm not going to unless you want me to, which basically said, there is no Black problem in America. It's a white problem that they have to figure out. Which is a really interesting. And so the second book is really about that process that my client and his friend went through. But what we're working on now is figuring out, he's already had a long conversation with the Black editor at Simon & Schuster, who was really talking about, things that he'd like to see in the book. Because with nonfiction, you work just in small pieces. You don't have to write the book. You're working on proposals.
Okay, you're right.
Maybe include a couple of chapters from the book, but it's really kind of, this is my car and it's got four wheels and it's got doors, and that's what the proposal essentially does. And this is why it's going to sell very well.
Almost like a business plan, almost.
It's exactly. And so what we're working on is what the title should be for the next book. Because in this case, the title has to be really tough, but not off-putting. So
a racial reconciliation title for a nonfiction book.
Yeah, I mean, we talking about white reckoning. Yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of things.
Right.
does the word reckoning work there, or should it be something else? And there's been a couple of books already out there that talk about white fright and all this kind of stuff. So there is there's a library of books starting to talk about this.
Right.
But from my perspective as an agent that's been so many years in the industry, I don't want to just do entertainment anymore. I mean, I was the newspaper reporter. I worked for the BBC.
Sure.
I've always looked at books as one of the last places where one can talk about things in a serious way. What books do is they tell us why. They answer the question why in a way that newspaper articles and magazines are much tougher for them to do that. They can tell you the story,
right,
but going into why.
And you've only got so much space with newspaper. Right. Like, you got to go top down, most important to least important at the bottom. So
right, and the other issue, and it's funny, I was talking to somebody about this yesterday as well, where I was saying the problem is that the landscape for small newspapers, local radio stations has been decimated over the last 20 years. And there are plenty of places, the Sinclair Group is a good example, where pretty right-wing, and let's be kind, just conservative, super conservative money has taken over these places. And so you're not getting the same kind of societal glue that local news and local newspapers will give you, because everybody's getting it from the internet, which is actually not true. But they're partly doing that.
Right.
Because, to quote one of my heroes, a guy called Stanley Crouch, who was a famously a wonderful writer and a great grouch. And somebody once asked him, I got to know Stanley Crouch and his material. I didn't actually ever get to meet him, but because I'm into jazz and I'm a big jazz fan and I play a little bit of jazz, and he used to write about jazz. And that's how I knew it. And then I found out that Stanley wrote a lot of other stuff as well.
Okay.
And somebody asked him what he thought of hip hop when it first started. And he said, hip hop is the result of the educational system removing any kind of music history and music education from the schools. And so you have a generation of kids who know nothing about, Charlie Parker and Lester Young and Louis Armstrong.
Right.
John Coltrane. They don't know who these people are. They're not played that much on the radio. Nobody talks about them. You're not taught. So they have no history, but they have a drive to create music. And so this is something that they found, they invented.
That's a pretty accurate depiction, actually.
It is. I mean, it's an interesting take. I don't think it's totally.
It really is.
Because you can
it's not completely accurate, but
you can trace
you can see how he got,
star and black poetry, but he's not wrong completely.
Right.
But when you look at that, and then you look at the landscape where local news and even some of the larger newspapers really don't, they're covering national news. They're not really covering local news particularly.
Right.
And the glue to that society starts to come apart.
Right, because the focus starts to go outside rather than where we can control it, which is at our level, local.
Our community. Let us learn about our community, what's happening in our community.
Right.
And so books are one of the few things still around that can give you a really great insight into why certain things are happening.
Right.
And what you might be able to do about them. And they can do that at length in a way that newspapers can't, because they aren't there anymore or don't want to.
Right.
Huh. So, I look at the publishing industry as a really interesting, and then we'll get to your questions. I promise you. Because I'd like to create a context for this whole conversation, because I think sometimes it's useful. And so as much as we can criticize publishing for many, many things, and I would be the first to agree with it, diversity is one of them, although they're now making a major inroads into that. But it was never about racism in the sense that most people would think of it.
Okay.
It was about the fact that when I started in publishing in the early 1980s, I was told African Americans don't read.
Okay.
And then Toni Macmillan came along, and she published, Waiting to Exhale, and everybody went, "Oh my God, yes they do." And that's before you even get to James Baldwin, but he was always, at a different level to
Right.
average, right? And so it wasn't racist in that sense. It was about looking at data as they saw it. The fact that the data was flawed because they weren't addressing the interests of that audience.
And that's
not
the
same as
danger
saying
of some
not the same as it's
statistics.
deliberately not doing that.
Right.
So what happened with diversity in publishing is that initially everybody said, "Oh my God, yes, you're right." But then the editors that were in place were starting to try and buy books for audiences that they really weren't particularly connected to, until the genius move of saying, why don't we hire a bunch of editors from diverse backgrounds who know what it is that they want, which is what's happening in publishing. Now it's 3 steps forward and 2 steps back, because publishing is very poor. The other reason that there wasn't a great diversity in publishing was because it doesn't pay very well.
Right.
And that's because it's an industry, somewhat like the fashion industry, that's dominated by women.
Right.
And so you have, it's filled with, publishing is filled with brilliant rejects, essentially, who have made it their mission not to be rejected anymore,
Right.
And for those, and so, but
that's an interesting quote right there.
Well, oh, thank God. One thing you can use from this interview.
Oh, there's a lot already.
Someone rambling. So here's with all this stuff, and there's plenty of other things that we can talk about. The fact is that as a society, we have created a marketplace in terms of publishing where we consider people's thought, ideas, to be so valuable and so important that we can actually affix a financial value to them. And that is a remarkable thing for a society to do. And it says great things about us. Is that system flawed? Well, yeah.
Sure.
But the fact that it exists, when you think about money, I give you a dollar bill, you give me a dollar bill. That's a piece of paper. The only thing that makes that paper of value is that we all agree that it has value. And we have an industry of ideas and thought where the same metric applies. And that's quite remarkable.
Very interesting. 100% factual too. Like when you take a dollar bill at its face, it's just a piece of paper.
Yeah.
The only thing that assigns value is your and my agreement that this is a dollar bill and this is what it's worth.
And there have been artists in the last, couple of decades who have gone out of their way to make not fake money, but art money, and they say, this is money if you want to use it as such. And it was an interesting experiment.
So would a writer's job then, if they're going to be successful, would be to convince their audience that this book is worth or maybe priceless, worth your investment?
Yes, exactly. Which is why finding good writers who have got something interesting to say that we can put a value on is so important. So if you're going to write another Sam Spade, it's not counterfeit, I'm not going to go that way, but its value is pretty minimal because you can go and read Dashiell Hammett and you can read the original. Why do you need a new one?
Right.
So what publishing is looking for is people that have original but marketable ideas, so that when somebody says, hey, I've got a great idea. What if, a vampire got AIDS? And it's like, no, no, you're not going there.
Yeah.
Dumb idea. I mean, yes, it has an appeal, but it's a dumb idea, and it just doesn't work.
So one of the things that I say to my client, I have a creative writing company.
Okay.
I started off as an editor myself.
Okay.
And for the last 10 years, I've been helping on the self-publishing side, because that's where I never got an agent. I was published by an independent publishing house. And so I have that bit of expertise in that small little niche. But what I often tell writers, and I want to kind of throw this at you to see from your end if it still applies, is you have to answer the question for the reader, why should I care? That's what
Yeah.
I tell writers all the time. If there's no reason for them to care, why should they buy the book?
Right. I know. I agree totally. I think there's among sort of beginning writers, there is, I've written a couple of books about writing, and
Okay.
look my name up. You can go and find them. There's 3 or 4 of them are still in print. Thank God.
Okay. I would like the links to that, because I think new writers would
Sure.
really appreciate that insight
Oh,
too,
no, I'm
and
happy to.
myself as well.
I've done one about narrative nonfiction. I've done a couple of books about writing fiction, one in collaboration with an old friend who had actually died. And they asked me to sort of, can you finish his book? Well, finishing his book meant I actually had to write it, because there was a manuscript. It's like,
yeah.
Thanks for telling me. But he and I used to talk about writing all the time. His name was Gary Provo, and he's a wonderful, wonderful teacher and a fantastic writer. He was the kind of writer that we all want to be without understanding that's what we want. His writing was completely invisible. You weren't aware that you were reading a writer.
Right.
You were just involved with what he was writing about.
Right.
And that's stunningly difficult to
do. It really requires, and this is another thing that I see with newer writers in particular. I was like this myself. It requires that you detach from it, in a sense. Like, even though it's your writing and it's coming from you, it can't be you in the writing. It has to be about the audience, and that's really hard to do, especially for a new writer when they're writing about what they like.
And it's so personal, and it's really interesting that I can talk about things. When I go, I mean, just a little plug. I'm actually going to be at a writers' conference in LA in October.
Okay.
It's in Beverly Hills, which I'm almost embarrassed to talk about, being a socialist, but nevertheless, it's a socialist with a little s, but nevertheless.
With a little s.
I guess my socialist friends would say, make your bloody mind up. Come on, one way or the other.
For sure, right.
But here's the thing that's so interesting. It feels so personal. And yet, then you meet with a group of writers, and it's like, oh my God, that happened to me too.
Right.
The idea that, when I write, I've just finished a new novel. It's the first novel I've written in. My son is now 21, and I've had a couple of nonfiction books done since then. But I haven't been writing fiction.
Okay.
It's just I can't do this job and write fiction and raise a kid at the same time.
Right. Yeah. Right.
It was just too much. I already have a family, if I can put it that way, with my colleagues and my clients.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
But in the process of writing books, writing fiction particularly, you come across this situation where a character is, what in the theater they call a spear holder. They're on the stage and they're standing there, and their presence is all that's needed.
Right.
But one of these characters steps forward and says something or does something, and to which you say, go away. What, I don't know. You have no role here. And then the character starts to argue with you. Yes, I should, and you find yourself in this bizarre situation where, it's all coming out of your head.
Right. Yeah.
You're having an argument essentially with
yourself.
You're not even aware it's there.
Right. I understand 100% what you're talking about.
And there are moments where you think, oh, well, damn it, fine. okay, you know.
Right.
And you can see moments like this in all kinds of stories. There's a classic example of what's his name? Silence of the Lambs. It's Harris. I can't think of his last name now. It doesn't matter anyway. I mean, it's famous enough that everybody knows it.
Yeah, the comments are going to kill me for not knowing the.
Yeah, well, me too. Me too. At least I can claim old age.
Yeah, I don't have an excuse.
Yeah, you're screwed, but I'm okay. You know. And so there's a moment in the story where two characters meet. Actually, no, it wasn't in Silence of the Lambs. It was in the one before that, the Red Dragon.
Okay.
Two characters meet. One of them is Lecter, and one of them is the main character, Will Graham. And even though Lecter is a small character in Red Dragon, what happened was that it was a book that was supposed to be about the hunt for a serial killer.
Okay.
But instead, I'm completely wrong. It was in Silence of the Lambs. It's been a long time since I read the book.
Okay.
But what happens is, instead of the book being about the hunt for a serial killer, which is what it was supposed to be about, it ended up being a book about Lecter as a major character.
Okay.
And it all starts with that moment where the two of them meet, when Clarice Starling meets with Lecter. No, I'm lying to you. It was in the first one, and I remember now why. Because they made it in, because he turns around. The first character is called Will Graham. And Will Graham goes to see him, having just recovered from being seriously injured by him when they arrested Lecter.
Right.
And so the book is about, how Lecter looks at him and says, I know why you've come to see me. You come to see me because you want to get the mindset back. He said, but you already have it. He said, you're just one of us. You've just never done it. And so the whole novel turns around on that scene and that dialogue. And it starts to become about Lecter rather than the search for Buffalo Bill.
Right.
And so what happened was, that novel, and I would put money on this, genuinely, that novel turned around because of the way that scene came out as he wrote it. And he saw that and started to follow what that thread took him to. And that's a common thing. And the editor was smart enough to leave it.
And that's a brilliant move, because the thing that people are going to connect to is not the plot, it's the characters.
Yes.
So that's a brilliant move. And
that's the point I'm trying to get across here, is that authors, when they pitch me, often, tell me the story of the plot of the story, or I can't tell you this because, I don't want to give them my story away. It's like,
I hate when I get that.
I couldn't care less about that, because plot is a mechanical thing. It's a piece of engineering, a piece of architecture. Why we read fiction, or even why we read non-fiction to a degree, is about the characters that we meet. Why do we read fiction? We read because we want to meet interesting people we haven't met before, in interesting places that we haven't been to before, under circumstances, so that you end up with, a friend of mine came up, there's only one plot. Now, my friend said two plots, but I actually think it's one, which is essentially somebody knocks on the door and a man goes on a journey, or a woman goes on a journey. That's
pretty
it.
Much. Yeah.
That's the plot.
Right.
You can read Joseph Campbell and get a lot more.
Right.
And they come back and they bring, prizes, rewards back to the world. But that's the plot. Right.
Something to do is a plot. That's all it is. It's just something to do.
Right.
People want to know why we do
that. But why are we so besotted with the story of Orpheus? It's because, not just because he went down to hell to rescue his beloved. It's because he chose to do that.
Right.
He chose. So it's what he chose to do. It's his choice.
Right.
you know, when
And it
they
kind of infuses the reader. What would you do in a situation like that? Would you choose to do this,
right,
understanding the balancing act of doing it versus not doing it? And that's what keeps them reading. Oh, he
right,
chose that. I wouldn't have chose that, but I want to see where this goes. And
yes,
so they
exactly,
keep going.
and that becomes this whole thing of pacing
Hmm.
and why what an author wants to hear is the kind of story that a friend of mine told me, where he was in Paris with his wife, and he was reading. I think it was a few years ago. I think he was reading Stephen King's latest novel,
Okay.
and he was so absorbed with this that he said, "Our first night in Paris, I went into the bathroom and I sat in the bath with a pillow and a blanket, and I finished the novel."
Oh man.
And my wife was sleeping, and
uh,
I didn't want to disturb her, but that's what you want to hear.
that's what you,
You
as
wanna-
a writer, you love that. One of my favorite, to toot my horn just a little bit, one of my favorite reviews ever. Somebody wrote on my Amazon as an Amazon review, I burned my dinner because I was reading this
Oh
so
yes,
much. I was so engrossed in that. I love hearing that. I sent her an Amazon gift card just to pay for her
oh
dinner
that's
since I
great.
burned it, but that's probably my favorite of all time. Of all time was she was so engrossed in it that she lost track of herself in the world. That's really your goal as a writer.
Yeah. So if I get so engrossed in one of your books that I miss my dinner at the French Laundry when I'm out there, then I'll
Then
let you.
I'll pay. That's what it. Yeah, I owe you. Well, I want to talk about that for a second. I want to pivot to
Yeah.
the writer side of this now,
Mhm.
because a lot of the people who are going to see this, new amateur, maybe somebody who's got a series, and maybe they want to be picked up by a publisher and move forward on the traditional side.
Right.
What are some of the mistakes? We'll just say like top three mistakes that you see from writers when they query you, or even when you take them on. What are some of the mistakes that writers do that they can avoid?
That's actually a really interesting question. Let me answer that to begin with what isn't exactly an answer to that, but will lead into it, which is
Okay.
that what am I looking for when I'm looking at somebody's submission to me? What catches me? And the thing about writing is that writing is not about putting words on the page.
Mhm.
That's coal mining. That's hard work.
Okay.
Writing is about thinking. So it's about shaping those words until they say exactly what it is you want them to say.
Mm,
Words are our tools.
right.
So when somebody sends something to me, if the way they're presenting their project and themselves is at its best what I would say good workshop writing, then I like to cook, so I'm going to use a cooking metaphor now.
Sure.
It's a bit like making everything look and taste like tofu,
Mm.
which I've never managed to cook properly. It's always been a bit tasteless to me.
I've
Now,
never tried
there
it
are
because
ways.
it
There
is
are
tasteless.
ways you can do it. I haven't quite mastered them yet. As opposed to making bolognese sauce that you can actually make that's meatless, where you can use eggplant and all the.
Right.
So what I'm looking at on the page is not the words as much as it is the thinking that has gone into how that idea. Remember, I was talking earlier about the fact this is an industry of ideas.
Right.
So what I'm looking for is that mind. I know from the first paragraph whether,
Mm.
whether I'm in. No, I don't make a decision based on that, but I know that my first reaction on reading a really good opening paragraph, is, please God, they can keep this going.
Mm.
This is good.
The
There's,
narrative hook
there's
is
a
important.
there's a mind at work here that understands not only what they want to say, but they're able to convey it in ways that don't use, that aren't flashy.
Hmm. What do
Flashy.
you mean? What do you mean when you say flashy?
when I was a newspaper reporter, when I first started out, I was told very explicitly, the best way to write something is write it as if you're writing a letter to your mother or a friend. Yeah, dear mum, guess what happened to me today? I saw a guy fall out of a tree. You know, you don't start, it was a dark and stormy night and the wind was whistling through the trees and I turned up in my car and, you know, you get to the point.
I think I can't remember where I heard this, but I think this is what you're talking about. Correct me if I'm wrong. Don't use a $20 million word when a $2 word will do.
Exactly. I mean, I hadn't heard that before, but I think that's right. You know, and very often the $2 word is
What's needed.
Right in Anglo-Saxon. We are
right.
That, you know, English-speaking people. All that means
right. Yeah.
We are.
Don't try to show off your vocabulary in your writing.
Right.
You're writing for your reader, not for yourself.
And you know, there's those of us that love language. You know, we have to be very careful that language is a tool, and it's not, you know, something that you can dress yourself up in, unless you really, the whole thing is about that. Then there's a different way. So if somebody says, you know, the sun pelted the window as it streamed through, you know, yeah, that sounds lovely.
Right.
The sun can't pelt anything. The sun doesn't pelt. So you're using a word that you happen to like that doesn't work, you know.
It doesn't communicate.
But, yeah, one must be aware of the literalness of what you're saying. And that's what makes a great writer. And if somebody says, well, how do I improve my writing? My go-to answer is usually, as long as you don't try and sell it to anybody, take a poetry class.
Okay. Now, why would you recommend that?
Because if you really study poetry, every word in a poem has a function. I mean, a good poem. Every word, it has a meaning. It has a function. It's the right thing in the right place.
With minimal words.
With minimal words. And
so every word becomes more important then.
Yeah, you don't, you know, you want to fix your writing, look for, you know, go on a witch hunt, you know, WHICH. And
I see what you did there. I like that. I like that.
And go, I wish it was mine, but I got it from somewhere else and I can't remember where now. And, you know, go on an adjective, you know, don't use words very or nice, as I was warned many, many years ago, you know, unless it's in people's speech.
Right.
When you're creating characters, bear in mind that very few people stand there saying, is that a gun you know, a Smith and Wesson 45 I see leveled at me, you know, it's like, you know, just so that I get it that they're being threatened. It's like, you know, how do people react? It's like, what are you doing?
Right.
You know, and what we say and what we do are very often at odds with each other. So when you're creating characters, you want to try and make them as realistic as possible within the confines of the story so that it becomes credible. It doesn't have to be real, because if you transcribed, and it's actually an interesting exercise to try and do, to take a little conversation with somebody and then transcribe it, and you will see how much nonsense, I was going to say something else, but
it's okay.
Public, well, then how much bullshit we talk about to each other.
Seriously.
Which you need to strip out. Because nobody's going to read all the ums and ers. And so it's artificial, but it has to be credible.
Right. Real versus realistic.
Yes, exactly.
The difference.
That's the difference. Yeah, that's nicely put. And so, you know, as a writer, that's what we're looking for. I'm looking for that mentality on the page from the very beginning.
And you can tell that from the first paragraph, from the narrative hook.
Yes, because in the end, writing is about thinking. It's not about words. I mean, words are the tools in the same way that paint is the tool.
Right.
But painting isn't about paint.
Right.
It's about what is on the canvas that comes out of the artist's mind.
Hmm.
And so writing is exactly the same thing. And people get confused with that because it's, I've been accused. I've read, one of the books I wrote was called The Elements of Storytelling.
Mhm.
And I started out by saying in an introduction that writing is really difficult. It's really hard. And a number of people really criticized me. I think if you go on Amazon, you might find them. That said,
They criticized you on that? Writing is hard?
Rubie says that the writing is really difficult, and that's not helpful in a helpful book. Books are supposed to be helpful, and it's like, oh, okay.
Wow. Okay.
But the truth is, it is. It's very difficult and it's very challenging. But
Mhm.
we are convinced because of the amount of writing that we do every day that if somebody says, "Oh, you write great letters," or "I love that little thing that you did," you can maintain that for a novel, and it's a good place to start. But it's not, it's something. If you want to become a really good writer, you need to find places where, apart from studying poetry and really understanding the tools that you're using and how you're using them, in the same way, there's a difference. One of the comparisons I make is when I used to talk about this is, I'd rather use music because I am a musician, but most people don't get it because they're not musicians.
Right.
So I use.
I'm a professional singer myself.
All right, so you understand what I'm talking about. But the nearest comparison that I have is actually carpentry.
Okay.
Anybody can bang together two pieces of wood and make a little bookcase, or even do something a bit more adventurous than that.
Sure.
Being a writer is learning to be a cabinet maker. They're all carpenters, but you got to learn to make the little bookshelves in order to progress to becoming the cabinet maker.
So how do writers do that? In your experience, like I understand how to pull those diamonds out and really find an author's voice or a writer's voice. In your experience as an acquisitions editor, how did you help the writer become the cabinet maker, to use your analogy?
I think the way to really do this is to search it. Don't worry about money. No, I told you I'm a socialist, And
They're not going to like that. They're not going to like that.
Well, but you're asking me for a process.
True.
And the process is a different thing to an end result. The process is such that you want to find any opportunity you can to be published by a place that you will be edited in. The moment you get somebody editing your material, then you will start to see where you thought you was working and where it wasn't. And the more you go through that process of having different people edit your material, whether or not you get paid for it, and the more you can use that experience, usually when somebody and I'm just as into it as everybody else, when somebody looks at my stuff and they say, blah blah blah, it's like, you're an idiot. Of course, that's not right, and then about 2-3 weeks later, I kind of think, yeah, maybe, okay, I can, do this.
You had to sleep on it. You had to sleep on it for a little bit, and come back and get out of the emotions.
And that's because what we do is one thing. The concept behind what we do is something else. And so if somebody's editing you, they are accepting your concept. They're just saying you're not executing it particularly.
Right.
And that is true if you're into sports or into, dance or into, it's true in any creative endeavor that there's always room for, cleaning the house before you sell it, polishing the car before you sell it, all of these things. And if you can't accept that, then you won't, in the end, improve in the way that, it may be fine for you. And if you want to, not you personally, but for one,
I get what you mean. Yeah.
If you want to self-publish something, that's fine. but the average self-published book probably doesn't sell more than 200, 300, 400 copies, if that.
Oh, it's less than that.
Yeah.
It's 25. Like that's
Yeah. Yeah. Very
it's
possibly.
less than that.
I was trying to be kind, but in professional publishing, if you can't sell 5,000 copies of the book that you're selling, nobody's interested unless there's something remarkable about the book. And
well, if there's something remarkable about it, more than 5,000 people are probably going to buy it.
Well, yeah, when I say remarkable, I mean, it might not be marketable.
Oh, okay.
So that's the thing. It could be a tremendous book about a specific thing. But maybe there's just, I've had rejections from people saying this is a niche book. Sorry, we can't do that.
Right. How to jump on a trampoline properly.
Yeah.
You might be able to deliver an idea about it that's so different and totally true, but nobody cares.
Skateboarding for seniors.
Right.
And that's a relatively small market, I think.
Yeah. Pretty sure.
Even if it's a good one, because you don't want to break a hip or a leg or an arm or something.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Now, I do want to talk about that for a second, if we could.
Sure.
What are the hardest books or genres in your experience to pitch?
It changes.
Of course.
That's the other thing, because when I'm taking a book on, I'm looking at something that is no interest specifically at this. Well, no interest is not right. Doesn't
minimal
interest now, because that book is not going to hit the market. If you go through mainstream traditional publishing for probably 2 years,
couple of years, right?
So I'm looking at things that are likely to be of interest to the reading public in 2 years' time.
Okay.
So if you're going to do a book, for example, that is a passionate and well-written defense of the oil and energy industry as it currently is, in 2 years' time, I think that's going to be a really, really tough sell.
So what you're saying is, when you get a book, you're not thinking about, oh, this is good now. You're thinking about, in 2 years from now, will this still sell? And if it won't sell in 2 years from now, you probably won't take the book.
And my thinking along those lines is partly colored by the fact that, as I said, I was a newspaper reporter and journalist for like 10 years. Starting in a little local newspaper in England and moving up until I was working in Fleet Street and for BBC Radio News. So, I had that progression. And I say that not to boast, but because it trained how I think.
Yeah. It's a part of your story, for sure.
And so I have a tendency, and other agents will tell you something completely different, because it's such an idiosyncratic business. But I have a tendency to look at the world around me. What is of interest? At the moment, we are in a grip, for example, of particularly in publishing, of books written by and for women, to the point where a lot of white male writers up to now have had it all to themselves, and now suddenly they're having to compete in ways that they're not that happy about.
I understand what you're saying, because I've had some particularly adult white males who are writers, but when I talk to them, they're completely discouraged. And they're saying exactly what you're saying. The market's dominated by women. They don't care about what I'm writing about. And
there is actually, there's a wonderful blogger, her name is Jane Friedman, who writes about publishing. And she did a piece not that long ago, or had a piece written for her by a writer who was saying, I was a best-selling novelist and I was sold in 18 countries and it was a huge deal and I did fabulously. And then my editor left, and the new editor wasn't that interested in, me or my book. And so we had to find another publisher, and that one did okay. And this is why I'm self-publishing my third book. So it's not just white men. It's also just that the publishing industry is very unforgiving. But if if I need to specifically talk about how I'm looking at things now, I kind of believe, because I want to, but because I think there's an evidence to back it up, that Kamala is probably going to be, or Kamala, I should say, is going to be
the next president.
Next president. Sorry,
it does seem to be shifting that way. I've noticed as well.
It is going to be tight, and I think most people don't pay attention to the fact that down ballot is going to be as important as up ballot. It is as important as up ballot, because if she has a Congress she can't work with, although Biden seemed to manage to get away with it. So that's one of the things that's very interesting about him.
So how does that affect the industry from your viewpoint, the publishing industry?
Well, it's going to when we change presidents in particular, we see changes in the pop culture. If you stop and think about it, we haven't actually seen too much in the Biden years, but that's partly because we're just recovering from a pandemic.
Right.
So everything has been sort of sent sideways because of that. But I think with the rise of Kamala, one of the things we're going to see is a very different approach to how we react with each other, interact with each other, and just things that are of importance. So I have a novel now that I haven't been able to sell, which I love, which is about three young women. One's black, one's white. Two of them are white. Who are the youngest one is middle class, and she stumbles at the beginning of the novel into being the director of a daycare center. And she realizes that the system is completely screwed. It's a private daycare center.
Okay.
And the novel is about how these three women figure out how to do daycare properly against the rules.
Okay.
And one in particular ends up kind of learning, because she comes from a very difficult background, she grows.
Okay.
That's a really hard novel to sell at the moment. But I think as we change and we look at this kind of stuff, there may be a chance for me to do something with that.
Because if you're trying to sell in America, the presidency changes, the viewpoint of the country changes with her ideology and policies and whatever she's going to put into office.
Right.
And so now people are more open to your topic matter, and that particular book caters to that topic matter.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, I can tell you what I was doing when Jack Kennedy was killed. I was 13 years old and I was living in England, but I know exactly what happened, where I was. I was in a car with my dad when I heard that news. There's no reason whatsoever that should, yes, it was a traumatic global moment in American presidency.
Sure.
But I think one of the things over the years I've begun to realize that, all the things that we always liked to think about Jack Kennedy, because he was a wonderful speaker, a great orator.
For sure.
Witty guy and smart as a whip. But all the things that we tend to associate with Jack Kennedy were actually put in place by Lyndon Johnson. He's the one that signed the Civil Rights Act. He's the one that established, Medicaid, Medicare, one of the two. I can remember which one it is. But he did that against the background of this growing war in Vietnam. And so a great deal of what he did was overshadowed by that.
Right.
So the war was what shaped us. Then after that, Watergate, the echoes of Watergate to this day are still rumbling through American minds, American thought. And as an outsider, I see this more than I think maybe people who were born here can see.
And you would, because you'd be able to, you'd be more of an objective viewpoint,
right,
than people who are in it, and especially in the middle of it, who are directly affected by it. Their viewpoint of it is going to be skewed in just what affected them, versus you can see both sides.
And I mean, it's interesting. The novel that I was talking about, I was working on, which we now finished, is actually about the first woman institutional police detective, which I think has, as an example, particularly if there is the change that we're talking about politically, it's about the first wave. It's about an unsung, for the most part, pioneer of the women's movement, who was a conservative, which is what is so interesting. She was a police officer. She was,
they tend to be more conservative police officers.
She didn't abide by, the corruption and the kind of the boys club stuff that was going on, and it still existent today in a much less degree.
Right.
But nevertheless, she was still there, and so I think that will reverberate with a population, a readership.
So, question.
Done before. So that's the point. It hasn't been done before. If you're doing something and you've read about it or seen it, then the odds are it's not worth writing on a professional level, because it's already been done. I don't want to, as I said before, I don't want to read a new Sam Spade, but there are lots of PI novels out there, and the PI novel in itself is still a vibrant format. Right. But it's got to have it's got to be familiar in terms of what you see around you.
Right. So you kind of have to be, not kind of actually, you have to be connected with the world to make an impact in the world.
Well, you have to be engaged. Well, connected. You have to be engaged with the world.
Engaged would probably be a better
in some way or form.
Right. So so the presidential election's an easy one, because we forecast that 4 years out. We know today, even though Kamala's probably going to be the president, in 4 years, there's the potential for a new one.
Right.
That one's easy to predict. What about other trends? Like,
well, I wouldn't say it's that easy the way the things are working out, but yeah, I mean, it won't be. It's not likely to be Trump, but it could well be Vance.
Sure, but we know it's either going to be Kamala for another term or somebody else.
Yeah.
And depending on who that is, we can then look at it and go, okay, his viewpoints are this. People are saying they support him. So these kind of ideologies are probably going to be supported.
Right.
Let's take something abstract, like, I don't know, a vampire dog. let's just say somebody wrote about a vampire dog.
Right.
What would get your attention in the way that you're thinking about publishing, where you're looking 2 years out? What would that book need to have? Like, what elements would the book need to have in it that you'd be able to sell 2 years from now? I know I'm throwing a weird topic at you. But...
Well, it's an interesting intellectual thought problem about editing. How could you make the most difficult issue into it? And the only way I could see doing that would be to make it a satire. You make it witty.
Okay. Now, why, if you say make it satire, make it witty, why do you think that would be successful 2 years from now?
Well, yeah, I mean, you could tie it to what's going on in the world, but in general, that's really not. I mean, most agents would turn around and say it's such a dumb subject that forgive me, but
sure. No, for sure. It's just, I've never even seen a vampire dog. I just wanted to throw something new out there.
There's no, I mean, the obvious thing is, and now you know something about me, is that I instantly go and try and fix something rather than just say no. If I think there's a value there, and given that you're a writer and you know what you're doing, my first thought isn't you're an idiot, because you have some kind of experience, you have some kind of background.
For sure.
So I'm thinking, okay, well, we could make this work. There's been Super Dog, there's been, Bat Dog,
Right.
There's no reason you can't have Dracula Dog,
Right.
And so, the creating something is one thing. Tying it to what's going on is a different kind of matter. because really that idea is a kind of a timeless, no societal change unless we sort of decide that all dogs are dangerous.
Right.
Is going to be a problem.
Hmm. Okay.
So I don't really see that example being honestly how I could apply that thinking to it.
Yeah, most agents would probably see this vampire dog and be like, how are we going to sell this? Unless it's for children and there's some special message and children love vampires and dog, like how are we going to tie this into something that
And
can sell?
actually, what you're just doing now, and what might be of interest to people, and I'm pointing this out explicitly, is this is the beginning of what an editorial conversation is between an author and an agent editor, where we're talking about, okay, I have this idea, and I'm thinking, well, okay, you could do this as a children's book.
Right.
You could do this as a humorous children's book. Let's see, how about this as an idea? Your dog is a vampire, but he really likes people, so he just chases rats and squirrels.
Right.
But that makes him incontinent, and so now this dog is like, having to deal with, like, does he have to wear like doggy diapers? Does he have to,
Right.
make sure there's a little place that he can go after he's eaten, and so you start fleshing out the story. But what we've done immediately is start to talk about this as a character,
Right.
confronting issues and starting to create the plot from who this character is.
Right.
And so what you're looking at here is not agenting, but editing, straight up editing in how you think.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, as an editor, and I tell my authors this when they come to me, and they'll say something like, I just need grammar, spelling, punctuation. You've probably heard this before. I just want grammar, spelling, punctuation edit. And I'll read the first page and I'm like, no, actually, you need a lot more than that. That's what everybody needs.
Right.
Grammar, spelling, and punctuation. Just looking at this first page, I use the first page a lot, the narrative hook. I use that a lot to determine how a book is organized, I guess, because I know as an editor that it's normally the first 3 chapters tend to flow better than especially the middle, if not the middle to the end, because those tend to be the pages that the author looks at over and over and over and over again.
Yes, that's right.
And so it's a lot more polished. When I look at a first page and that first paragraph, I'm still just kind of like, I have to tell them we got to change it. We got to change it, because when a writer or when a reader gives your book a chance, you don't want them to regret that chance.
Absolutely. Yeah, the last thing you want someone to throw it across the room going,
right,
cheated me,
right.
You don't want that.
I'll never get those 7 seconds back. You don't want them saying
curses.
Right. And so, like, I often tell my writers, like, this is you're writing for you, but at the same time, you're not writing for you. You're delivering a message. You're connecting with your reader in a specific way.
Right.
But you want that way to be something where they want to be there in that connection. Kind of like having a conversation. If one person's just screaming at you, you're not going to want to be there for very long.
Exactly. I mean, I would rephrase that slightly in the sense that you're writing for yourself, but you're editing for your audience.
Okay, I like that better.
Your audience. That way, because the first draft is going to be the first draft. Some people write long, some people write short. So if you write long, you're going to have to hack it back. If you write short, you have to fill it out. But you want to get to 70, 80,000 words. Roughly the average novel is. You can go down to 60, but 70 to 80 is really where you want to be. What I usually talk to people about is saying, when you look at your novel, say to yourself, what if, and then fill it in, or suppose. So if you go, what if an English Elizabethan sailor is shipwrecked off the coast of Japan and becomes a pawn in a power play to take over the island. Now that essentially, without all the curlicues, is boiled down Shogun.
Right.
Which is 1,000 printed pages.
Right.
And it misses a great deal, but it also keeps the focus there.
For sure.
Suppose Robinson Crusoe was cast adrift on Mars. And now suddenly you have the essence of the book, The Martian. If you stop to think about it, because that's what it is. It's Robinson Crusoe.
That's interesting. Okay. So that's interesting. Because I don't think enough, especially new writers, writing is a relatively inexpensive thing to start. The face of writing. You need a laptop computer, which pretty much everybody has, and Microsoft Word, which is $5 a month. Like it's not an overly expensive thing to start. But once you start,
you've forgotten the bottle of whiskey, but that's another matter.
Or coffee, yeah, whatever.
Or coffee,
Wine, whiskey, coffee, your drink of choice. But the art of storytelling and holding interest, that's very difficult, especially if you're just starting out, because you have to understand, what does your audience want to read about? What's already been out there that's tired, and why should they care about yours versus the next writer over? And people get discouraged with the why should I care question, because they can't really answer it. And if you can't answer that, you're kind of dead in the water.
Right, but that's why, as I say, that you write to please yourself, but then you edit, because that early effort is there.
Right.
It's they used to talk about Michelangelo, when Michelangelo was doing his statues, that he would sit for days just on a chair staring at this block of marble. And clearly what he was doing was he was actually going through the act of seeing within that block of marble the thing that he wanted to create. So
he was creating the statue.
When he finally took up a mallet and chisel, he knew exactly where he was going and what he wants to do. And so I would argue that the writing equivalent of that, and people hate when I say this.
Are you going to go into plotting versus pantsing?
Well, what I was actually going to say was write a synopsis of the story from beginning, middle, and end. It doesn't have to be hugely detailed.
Right.
And nobody is standing behind you with a whip saying, stick to what it is you're supposed to be doing.
Right.
But the truth is, when the novel starts to go sideways, fixing it is very difficult if you have no clue where it's going wrong.
100%.
Whereas if you have the synopsis, and the synopsis started to take you either to a place you didn't think it was going to go to, or you started to deviate from that synopsis, you've got a place to start looking at to see where it is.
Easier to get back on the path. Right.
And while it may be true that writing your first novel is really, I know people, I was one of them. My first novel is locked in a vault, buried in concrete somewhere. I mean, it's just like, no. It took me 5 years to finish it.
Yeah.
But I finished it. And that was the achievement, that I finished it.
Right.
And so nobody's forcing you to do this. But once you get to I've always had this theory that you really can't call yourself a professional writer, novelist, whether it's fiction, nonfiction, but let's talk about fiction.
Sure.
Till you get to the third book. The first one is the book that you're compelled to write. So that's, kind of a given.
Right.
Hopefully you do the right things in order for it to be published. The second one is usually a disaster, because what the first one did was not just mark an accomplishment in terms of finishing it. It taught you how you write fiction. The second one, suddenly you don't have all those things that you wanted to write because you've written them out. So now you're really struggling with that whole issue of, how do I write? which is why the second one, if you've got a good editor and you're a bit lucky, it'll be okay.
Right.
You know, because between you and what you've learned and the editor and what he or she can do for you, you figure it out so that it's a decent, you know, what do they call it? Sophomore slump. There's a term
Right.
for it.
Right. Yeah.
The third one is where you realize, okay, I got to figure out how I do this without being formulaic.
Right.
So what are the lessons that I've learned? And as I say, I keep going back to music, particularly, you know, jazz, because I'm an improvising musician. So I've been trained
Right.
to do this. And in the same way, you know, I like to play. There's a sport called squash that I love to play. I'm
Okay.
pretty awful at it, but nevertheless, I still love to play it. And I've got people that are much better than I am that still play with them. So it's like, okay, I'm good.
Right. Right.
But there are ways to practice it. And it's the same thing with music, where you have a thing called practicing with limitations. So you impose certain things on yourself, like you learn all your scales on the guitar, and you think about learning the guitar in terms of there's this position and that position and all the rest of it. But to really master the instrument, what you need to do is be able to play those scales on one string.
Right.
Play it all the way up, and so, or I'm going to learn a tune and I'm going to play the whole tune on one string.
Right.
And suddenly you're not looking at patterns and you're not looking at shapes. You're looking at a fundamental understanding of the instrument. Somebody once told me that George Benson, when he was very young, said to, I forget if it was in an interview or whether he was talking to this, I can't remember now. But when, it didn't matter what key he was in when he was playing, he said, like, it seemed like all the notes that on the neck that were important to that key kind of lit up for him.
Right.
He knew exactly where he wanted to go, you know, without thinking about, I'm in this position or I have to do, you know, there are other things you have to master, but writing is like that. You know, you learn the landscape, you learn the tools. The thing that aggravates me is when you go to writers' conferences and they ask the famous writer to give the keynote. Not that I particularly want to do a keynote, but they ask them to do the keynote about, you know, how he became. What that writer usually can do is talk about how they figured it out.
How he did it. Right.
But agents and editors are the people that came up with the language of describing what it is you're doing and why you could do it slightly differently or better.
100%. In music, just from my experience with what you're talking about, you get to a point, like I'm a singer, like I said.
Right.
So my thing is performing.
Right.
I don't play an instrument, I sing and dance. But you want to get to a point where you're not thinking.
Yes.
For us, where you're engaged with the crowd, you know the notes, you know the song, you've practiced it at home, you know exactly how your throat is supposed to feel, you know exactly how. Now you're just performing.
Right. And that performance, if I may jump in, is a form of storytelling.
Yes.
Because the words in the song are a story.
Right.
And if you listen, you know, there's a song, don't mean to interrupt you, but there's an interesting example of this. If you, there's a song in My Fair Lady that goes, all I want is a place somewhere far away from the cold night air with why an enormous chair, oh, wouldn't it be lovely? And it's done that way.
Right.
I saw a version of Lena Horne singing this on a TV show in England. And she prefaced it by saying, I'm on the road 9-10 months of the year, and I'm in different places all the time. So one night stands or a week here, and then we're off on the bus and we're doing that. And so I'm going to do this song with that in mind. And suddenly she was telling a story with the same words and the same music.
Right.
Like, all I want is a place somewhere far away from the cold night air.
Right.
An enormous chair. Oh, wouldn't it be lovely?
And it communicates a completely different message.
That's right. And so that leads to something in music that's also true in writing. How you say something is as important, or if not more important, than what you're saying.
I love that. A couple of questions from different authors here. One I can kind of answer, but since you're the expert and the professional, I think they want to hear it from you. Why
Absolutely.
is it easier for a celebrity to get an agent than someone who learned the art as a profession?
Well, that goes back to my initial statement. This is about selling books. You know, if Taylor Swift, God bless her, decides she wanted to write a novel, it wouldn't
No,
matter what that novel was. People would fix it, they would get it right, and her name alone would ensure that copies of that book were sold.
I don't even think she has to write a novel. She would just have to put her image and her name on somebody
Well,
else's
that's
novel.
usually what happens, actually. But then, like, you know, Gene Hackman, for example, has retired from writing, retired from acting,
Hmm.
and was working with a professional writer, but he has turned himself into a novelist.
Oh.
Ethan Hawke has had several novels published, and he is a seriously good writer.
Hmm.
Robert Shaw, who played, the thug in the blonde thug in which was it? One of the Bond movies. I can't remember which one it is now. From Russia with Love.
Okay.
Was a highly respected actor who was also a novelist who won awards for his writing.
Mm.
But he wasn't famous enough that would have made a difference.
Right.
It's with the publishing industry, particularly of the nonfiction, but it's also true of fiction to a degree. If you've got an ace in the hole, where you have a network of people, where you have an audience ready-made that is willing to put their hands in their pockets, and it doesn't matter how good you are. If you've got that, then you and I, which we won't do, can think of a whole ton of published authors out there that really shouldn't be published, but they have those. They have those that
Yes.
connection. And interestingly, although you didn't ask me the question, it connects to why. How is it that self-published authors? How can they move over into the? Well, maybe you did sort of allude to
That
it.
was going to be my next question, actually. So I'm
How do,
glad.
how do they move over? And what's interesting is that most successful, and you probably know more about this than I do, but my sense is that most successful self-published writers are very good at marketing and publicity. They are not particularly good at writing. And the problem is that when and what's her name? Sorry, my brain is just shot today.
What
Colleen
book?
Colleen Hoover,
Okay.
who has been so successful as a self-published writer that she made a fairly serious article about her in the New York Times. She was bought up by one of the big five publishers, but those mainstream books have not done nearly as well as her self-published books.
Right.
One has to ask why. And I think the answer is I tried to read one of them. I really couldn't. I mean, I'm sorry I don't do romance because I would have loved to have done romances, but I couldn't read half the books. And if I figured that
Right.
out, if I can't finish a romance book, I had no
No
place
business
to sell
writing
them.
one.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, no, trying to sell them.
Or trying to sell one. Right. Sure.
I mean, I had a couple of clients who had connections and they had already established themselves. So it's not that, and I do commercial women's fiction, not a lot, but I do so.
Okay.
But it's to do with the quality of writing. So how well you write is only part of the solution.
Mm.
It's like, how can you, which is why it's always good when you're starting out to look at the genres. Romance is a great place because there's a huge need for romance writers to this day, and it
Mm-hmm.
just gets bigger and bigger. And one of the things, going back to 2 years and all that, suddenly you find gay romance. I don't know if anybody's done any transgender yet, but I mean, it's.
Yeah. I've
But
had a couple hit my
I
desk.
don't sell in that. I don't work
Right.
that area, so I don't have a lot of depth in my knowledge about it. But that's that's the answer to that, is that it's like, just because it's well written doesn't mean to say it's going to be popular.
Right. Is it, by the way, is it still the big five? I heard one was being bought out and it's
Well,
now
Simon
going to
Simon
four.
and Schuster's been on the block for years and they pulled it off, but so far it's still
Okay. Still the big five. Okay. You kind of answered a couple of these other ones from the authors. So I guess I'll ask you this one. Why should a writer want a literary agent versus just throwing it up on Amazon or self-publishing with multiple editors and really polishing it? What can a literary agent do that they can't do by themselves?
Well, let's tackle the back end of that question first, because in particular, this is something you know about probably as much as I do, which is that if you just throw something up on Amazon, it's not going to work.
Right.
It's not. I mean, if you're lucky, you're saying 25, I'm saying a couple of hundred, but it doesn't really matter. That's not, I mean, it feeds your ego to a degree, but that's it.
And unfortunately, a lot of authors, just to interject for a second, I
Mhm.
found that it's more about their ego than it is about writing.
Yeah, well, it's the same, and the same problem is true in music, although we will get back to that. But
Sure.
interestingly, I look at being an editor, like I have a regular gig that I do in New York, and
Hmm.
usually it's with a singer and a bass player
Okay.
singing, the American song. And I'm an accompanist. Now, there's just me and the bass player and the singer, so it's a pretty naked experience and
Right.
very intimate, and that's great. And
Right.
everybody has to listen to everybody, because if you don't, it just
Yeah.
not
It goes off the rails really fast. Yeah.
but it's not that much fun. I'm not. There's got to be an interaction. There has to be a musical conversation, and the
Sure.
same thing is true when you come to writing. I think about editing as being it's the same as being an accompanist.
Okay.
I am there to make that person look better,
Okay.
to make them feel safe so that they can start to do things that they might not want, have thought they wanted to do.
Right.
And I'm there to help them do that. And that's the same thing with editing. You're there to make the writer look better, so that, when somebody says, "Oh, what did you do as an editor?" And you think, well, that was successful because the book was published. I know what I did. But if they
Right.
can't spot it, then I did a good job.
Right. Yeah.
And I mean, I'm talking about the author not really spotting it.
Right.
Once
For
it's
sure.
published, and it's like it has this seamless thing.
Right.
And so when you're self-publishing, the only way to do it properly gets expensive.
Hmm.
First of all, you have to pay for an editor.
Multiple. I recommend multiple editors.
Well, I'm thinking one editor to do what would be called the line edit. Then you've got another editor to do the copy edit.
Hmm.
Then you've got somebody to do the book cover.
Hmm.
I mean, if you use AI, which I think is a horrible idea, but nevertheless, use an artist, but they'll do a better job. They really will.
They really will. Yep.
A book designer, even if if you're going through Amazon, there are some templates you can use, but a publicist
Hmm.
who can probably teach you. I mean, what you want is a publicist who will work with you to the point where they will teach you what they're doing,
Right.
so that you can learn to do that with the next book.
Right.
So already you have this team of people, and you're going from being an author to a publisher.
Hmm.
They are not the same things.
They're not the same. One's a business and one is the creative.
Exactly. And so immediately it's like, well, why should I just whop it up there? Well, that's why you shouldn't just whop it up there if you're serious about it.
Right.
So if you want an agent, first of all, an agent, and you pick and choose who you want as an agent, because you talk to them and you know the books that they've done, hopefully, and you have a sense of how they work. An agent is a partner in the same way. If you needed a doctor or a lawyer or a dentist, you don't go into your dentist or your lawyer and say, "Hey, this is what I got to do. This is, do this for me."
Right.
They'll laugh at you and say, "Well,
Right.
have you thought of A, B, C, D, E, and F?"
Right.
Because you got to take that into account. And so that's what we do. I am a consultant. I am a cheerleader. I have connections. When I go to certain editors, not everyone, obviously, but when I go to certain editors who I've known for a reasonable amount of time, and I think the book is appropriate for them, when I bring them that book, they will pay attention to it. I will negotiate the contract. The author signs everything. The author drives the bus, not me.
Right. Yeah.
My job is to create choices.
You're the navigator.
For that author. Well, not even a navigator. I can say, you can go down this road, or you could take this little path, or, what about this? Or, I give them choices. I give them options. I can give them advice on those options, but the decision is the author's.
Okay. All right.
And the last thing is that editors change jobs these days, like most people change their socks. So the one stable person in your writing career is very likely going to be your agent.
Okay. I like it.
Okay.
Best advice for a writer starting and wanting to secure an agent?
Just write something. Do all the things that we've been talking about. Make the book the absolute best that you think it can be before you send it off. Don't, and I say that with this one caveat. And again, this comes from music, really interestingly. I am friends with a couple of them, but in particular, one of the world's great jazz guitar players. I won't tell you his name because I don't want to embarrass him, but he is among the top maybe 10. Not so well known, although he's really well known in the industry. He's worked with some serious major people, all years and years and years. And he got he was one of the first people to go to a university in California to get a jazz performance degree. They actually created the degree for him.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And he comes from a musical family, and he said to me, and he's been public about, I'm not saying anything he hasn't actually talked about publicly, but he said after he got his degree, he stopped playing. He said, because perfectionism made it just, I was exhausted. I couldn't deal with it. Just perfectionism was just, and he stopped playing for about 6 to 9 months. And then he started picking up the guitar again and refound his way. And I actually had a somewhat similar experience, which is how we ended up having this conversation.
Okay.
Because I stopped practicing for a whole bunch of time until my son was born. And when he was 5, he wanted to start learning to play the violin. And so I picked up a guitar again. So he would have the kind of a model of somebody to practice. So it wasn't this exotic thing that you did. It's like if you practice,
Right.
And I found I was really enjoying it again. And it was a nice kind of other thing from writing,
For sure. Yeah. Another creative thing.
And so you make it the best that you can make it. But if you start fiddling with ands and these, then you're done. And so you send it off, and you send it off with all hopes. And then, when somebody comes back to you and said, what on earth were you smoking when you wrote this? Then you have to kind of think, are they right or are they wrong? Is there something, one of mine, it's not their fault they don't get it.
Right.
Right. They're idiots, okay, but they're idiots because you haven't done the job properly. You can be humble enough to understand that there's something there. If they say, it just didn't work for me, but have you thought about doing X, Y, and Z? Then you're getting response as opposed to, just somebody saying, no, thank you.
Right. And most writers, they get the no thank you and the kind of the generic, this doesn't fit, with our. So.
But it's not personal. It's not about you can't write. Very often it's about, we don't do this book, or I've just done a book like this, or I just didn't connect with it.
Right.
Because that's the thing about what we do, is it's very personal.
Right.
It's really subjective. And the fact that I can turn around and say, this was really a piece of crap, which I really genuinely try not to do.
Right.
Sometimes there's no way of avoiding it. But that's because it's usually because it's slapdash.
Right.
And nobody's bothered to do the work.
Right.
That's what the issue is. Don't be going on the stage to be a tap dancer with, some major famous person.
Right.
You haven't done the work.
Right. You're going to embarrass yourself.
They used to say that about Art Blakey, who was a very, very famous jazz drummer who would let people sit in with the band. But Art was fierce. I mean, everybody that came through Art's band ended up becoming major players.
Okay.
And if you wanted to get on stand with Art Blakey, sure, he'd let you, but they would be pretty tough if you didn't make it.
Right.
Make sure you got your shit together.
Right.
Before you sit in with Art Blakey,
Right.
Go and sit in with the local drummer and go through some of the basic things first.
For sure. So hire an editor, writers.
Absolutely. I mean, and the other thing is, and you may do something on this down the road, but there are a lot of people. I was saying earlier, people turn themselves. Anybody can be an agent. Anybody can be an editor. So you're looking for people that have a track record. The people that know what they're doing. If you want to see if you can talk to some of their clients. I mean, if people want to know how I agent, you can call some of my clients. I don't have a problem with that. I mean, people have left me. I've got rid of people. It happens. It's not personal.
Right.
Yeah, people.
Yeah, you always do want to do your research on an agent.
Yes, absolutely.
Just to see how they are with a book like yours. If that's the kind of agent you want representing you, like an author has the choice for that as well. Like they should hand the book over to somebody that they feel comfortable has bought in as much as possible, that they can buy in as close to the author's buy-in.
Right. And you need to be able to, if you're going to choose an agent. I mean, I'm a member of a group that is now calling itself AALA, the American Agents Literary Association.
Okay.
It used to be AAR, but we kind of revamped and changed the name.
Okay. It's
the same organization.
Okay.
And so they have a huge roster of agents on there, and that would be the first place I would go to look for an agent. Are you a member of AALA?
Now, why? Well, let's just say there's a brand new agent.
It has a canon of ethics, and it has there are milestones you have to meet in order to become a member. And most agents, especially new agents, which is what you just asked me, and I did actually hear that. Most agents that are starting out learn their craft at the knee of more established agents. So they're usually in agencies, small agencies. It doesn't matter the size of the agency. It's like if that agency has been in business for a little bit, then the people there are likely to have learned something. Well, I mean, there are 7 agents at FinePrint now, and there was at one time 10 of us, and then I deliberately started not replacing people when they left because I wanted to be an agent. I didn't want to be a managing partner in a company. I didn't do what I did.
You wanted to be an agent, not an agency.
Yeah, well, and I mean, we're an agency, but and then my business partner decided she didn't want to be a boss anymore. And so for a while, it was just me and a couple of other people. And I was totally fine with that.
Yeah.
And now we're sort of growing again. And this is sort of a natural progression.
Okay.
We can cover more, different people do different things. We don't all do the same thing.
Well, I do want to talk to you about that. My next question was, actually, you know what? Let me ask that later. Talk about your agency how does that work? Because some people think when you go to an agency website and you see the list of agents, I think nowadays the thought is, even if I send it to this person, I'm being sent to their assistant. I'm not even going to their desk. Is that true?
In my agency at the moment, that is not true. But even if it is, I mean, actually, to me, that might be true. But the truth is that the people that sort of do first reads for me are taking a lot more time and care and effort in looking for stuff for me than I might take when I go through this, because I've got so much to read, so much to do, submissions, research, running the company, that I can really only give time to things that are worthy. And actually, these 2 people have already found 2 projects for me. one of which I've just signed up.
Nice.
And it's so if you have a good reader, and at the moment I have a couple of really good readers, they know, and they'll write me readers reports, and they're learning how to be in the business.
Right.
The people that are doing the reading for me want jobs in publishing.
Right.
So in exchange for doing the work that they're doing for me, I'm teaching them about the industry. And I'm specifically teaching not just what I want, because some of the things that they find they really like, and it's like, it's not for me. So they'll send it off to different people in the company.
Okay.
Within the company itself, if something comes to me and it's not for me, it'll go to Christine, go to, Lauren, whoever it happens to be.
So the readers actually, they read it to see which agent would work best in that book. It wouldn't just be for you.
Yeah, but also they are prepped by saying, we are looking for something. I have a couple of different things that I ask them to do. The first is, if regardless of what I tell you about what I may or may not be looking for, if something speaks to you, I want to know about that.
Okay.
So I want to know their personal reaction to something, because in the end, that's what we want in a book. You want to get a response to that. And so it doesn't matter if it's commercial women's fiction, even if it's a romance. If it speaks to them, I want to know about that. And then there's somebody in my company that does romance, and so I send it to her.
Okay.
This sounds like it's for you. And it's like, well, okay, let me look at it, and we'll talk about, how sellable it is, how well done it is. They'll want to talk to the author and how receptive they are to getting editorial input. All of those things go into whether or not I'll take somebody on. I don't want to fight with somebody. If they don't like what I'm saying, that's fine.
Right.
My opinion is my opinion. And however much people put me on a pedestal or don't, no, please God, don't. My opinion is worth just that.
Right.
And nothing more.
Okay, so what about somebody who wants to do what you do? What would be your advice for them? Brand new person, new connections, but they want to they're a writer, they want to represent other writers. What would be your best advice for them?
Try and find somewhere where you can learn the job. I mean, try and work as a reader and an editor, if for a publishing house, or try and find an agency somewhere that will let you read for them and train you to a degree. And develop the discerning eye.
So what, would that be acquisitions editor or editor, entry level editor? If you've got the skill for it.
Anybody that getting paid to be an editor, truthfully. I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, if somebody wants to intern with you, you're going to teach them something.
Yeah.
And so they're going to be better off. And I don't mean to put you in a place where, I'm being disparaging. It's not what I'm saying at all.
Sure.
What I'm saying is you are somebody that knows about this. And so if somebody can read for you, then you have specific things that you're looking for.
For sure.
So they need to be trained to start looking for that.
100%.
Now, they work for somebody else and they want something else, but you're starting to develop that muscle, that discerning eye.
Right.
And what are you looking for? How many copies of this book can be sold? I mean, it is the basic statement, which sounded at the beginning like something that was just anathema.
Right.
And now at the end, we start to see that it's actually the defining issue.
Right.
In terms of professional publishing.
Right. Peter, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm
sorry we went on a bit, but I did say I could talk.
It's all right. This is all of this stuff for somebody who is trying to get in, or somebody who's brand new. And, you and I both know there's so much misinformation out there for what a writer could, should, stay away from, don't do. It's good to get insight from people who've done it.
Yeah.
And are doing it. And, particularly for somebody like you who is an author and a writer yourself, you understand the struggle bus that some of these writers are on.
Right.
When it comes to creating something and putting all your hope into it. And 100+ hours of writing and going through it, and then the millions of rejection letters that you're going to get from other people and staying the course and all of that. So all of this stuff, it's really valuable for
All right, I'll tell you.
authors.
I'll give you two ending pieces. One of them was that I had when I was an editor, actually, I had an author I worked with who got nominated for an award, and great. And she said to me one day, we were having a drink at one of these workshops that we go to, and she said, "If ever I meet the bitch that made me like this, I'm going to kill her." To her, writing was not a choice, really. But when I give talks, so I'm going to have to get another story now because too many people have said this. But there was a story, a Zen story that somebody told me. It was about a guy who wanted to be a famous violin player. So he got the opportunity to audition with a major violinist. So he plays for the guy, and the maestro says, "Not enough fire," and that's it. And the guy's devastated, but he goes off and he sort of licks his wounds, and he becomes a very successful businessman. And then years later, the maestro is playing a concert, and so the businessman goes backstage afterwards to see him and say how wonderful it was and how much he enjoyed it. He said, "You probably don't remember this, but years and years ago, I auditioned for you, and you said not enough fire. And I, to this day, don't really understand what that means." And the maestro said, "Oh, I say that to everybody."
Oh.
And the guy was incensed. He said, "What? I could have been a great player if it wasn't for you." And the maestro says, "No, you wouldn't." He said, "If you were going to do it, you were going to do it despite anything I had to say to you." And so I will leave you with that thought.
I think that's brilliant, because too many times I see writers give up before they really ever have a chance to write. A lot of times it's because somebody in their family or their wife or their husband or whatever invalidated them and discouraged them. But the ones who, I don't want to say who are born to do this because it just sounds so cliche, but the ones who really, really want to do this, they find a way.
Yeah.
They find a way.
Somebody asked Art Blakey. No, I talked about Art Blakey just now. Somebody asked Art Blakey to define what he meant by talent. Now, Art Blakey, people may have heard of Wynton Marsalis. Wynton Marsalis was working with Art Blakey when he was 18, as was Clifford Brown. You could just go through Lee Morgan. You could go through maybe Horace Silver. Just everybody that went through his band. And somebody asked Art Blakey what he thought the definition of talent was, and he said, "I think talent is the speed with which you learn something." And I've always really clung to that.
Yeah. That's an awesome quote.
Yeah.
Are you open for submissions now for those writers who are looking?
I am, but I'm pretty curative. But that doesn't mean to say that I won't recommend things and pass it along to other people in the company.
Okay.
But if you go to the website, the FinePrint website, you'll see roughly what we're all looking for.
And that's FinePrintLiterary.com, right?
It's actually FinePrint Lit.com.
FinePrint Lit.
FinePrint Lit. All one word.
What would, let's just say, if you were to point out a genre that you are looking for, what would it be?
I'm always looking for good thrillers.
Thrillers?
Good thrillers, yeah, and good crime novels. But they got to be really good. I mean, I wish I represented Dennis Lehane.
Dennis Lehane.
Lehane.
If
you don't know his work, he's a former. A lot of the people that I end up taking on are people for whom words are tools. So they worked as journalists. They worked in advertising. They already have those tools. They're trying to figure out how to use them. Okay. And they have, and strong characters. Anything that has a really strong character in it from the very beginning, that usually catches me, because you want to care about that person. You want to know what's going to happen next. The plot, I don't care about the plot, really. As I say, plot is what characters do next.
Right. Peter, thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate you helping me, taking me on. Thank you.